Oh, I've got to be quick. I just checked the battery life, and Western civilization is only at 1%. It might flicker out at any time. Before it does, this is The Daniel Natal Show. Aristotle said that every government has a different end goal. The end goal of an oligarchy is the transfer of the wealth from the many to the few. The end goal of a democracy is equality. The end goal of a republic is the promotion of virtue among the people. The 18th century French philosopher and moralist Montesquieu agreed with Aristotle in recognizing three basic forms of government. In Montesquieu's taxonomy, these are namely despotism, monarchy, and republic. Like the Greeks, Montesquieu said that republics rule by virtue. He said that a monarchy is ruled by honor, and despotisms, they're ruled by fear. Why I mention this is because after the post-World War II period, our government changed from a republic, which ruled by virtue, to a despotism, which ruled by fear. This is illustrated when the government hired propaganda godfather Edward Bernays to create a public relations program to allay fears over atomic war. On the contrary, said Bernays, you should exaggerate the danger, stoke the fear. A scared populace is a populace easy to rule. Subsequent to that period, we had one manufactured crisis after another, with kids trained in schools to duck under their desks and put their hands over their heads in anticipation of nuclear war, much like schools today are used to train kids to live in fear of a disease, or after 9/11, when the public was trained to live in mortal fear of invisible terrorists. It's important, by the way, for the threats to be as invisible as possible, as unavailable to be fact-checked as can be. Why I mention this is because I wanted to stress to people how powerful you are, yet I keep seeing, especially among the young, this diminished sense of their own power, and this inflated sense of the power of the government. The reality is, the government is far weaker than you think it is. I watched an interview with a general who had admitted that if every soldier, police officer, National Guardsman, CIA officer, FBI field agent, and so forth were brought together, the government would only have about 3 million people to police 340 million Americans. They would only be able to lock down 6 US cities at most. That's it. I watched another person, a sheriff, admit that most of their authority comes from perceived power, not from real power. They rely on the public to work with them because they don't have the manpower and resources that you think they do. Thomas Madden in Empires of Trust writes, even at its peak, Rome had no more than about 200,000 men under arms across its empire. That was far too few to hold down an empire stretching from Scotland to the Persian Gulf. The United States has approximately 1.5 million troops, which is likewise far too few to dominate a world of 6.5 billion people, should the world not wish it. Yet both powers had and have sufficient military power to respond to numerous local threats, or even several major threats to security among their allies. That is all that is needed. That and trust. For without trust, everything else falls apart. Without trust, other powers will arm themselves, leading inevitably to insecurity, war, and collapse. Why am I saying all this? Because I was online with some young people and I accidentally asked one of them their middle name, after sharing my own rather eccentric middle name. Even though I didn't ask for a first name, a last name, or a location, they all clammed up as if I were doxing them. Although I shared their concerns about privacy and intrusive government surveillance, I also had to strike a balancing note and explain that mentioning a middle name in no way endangered them. After all, if I called information and said, I'd like to find this person, I don't have a first name, a last name, or a location, all I have is their middle name, would the operator be able to find them? No. They'd laugh in my face. There is no directory of middle names that would locate someone. Yet none of that matters. To the young people, their sudden constraint made perfect sense, irrespective of the facts. One of them explained to me how they had to be shrewd with their private information. They weren't gullible like boomers and Gen Xers. They were savvy, cyber sophisticates. This came as some shock to me, given the fact that the younger generation are the most surveilled group in human history. They're the first to willingly create CIA files on themselves on social media, and the first to document every meal they eat on Instagram. They also are the first generation to voluntarily place surveillance equipment in their own homes and dash cams in their cars as they drive. So, forgive me, some part of me didn't buy their narrative of the shrewd young generation brilliant at protecting their privacy. So what was behind the sudden constraint? It occurred to me. Post-Columbine, the younger generation were educated in schools that were in many cases built by the same contractors who constructed prisons. They were hustled through security, patted down, made to walk through metal detectors, and so forth. They were also flooded with mass media about serial killers and stalkers. So despite living in the safest time in human history, judging by Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, they think that there are serial killers everywhere. Psychologists call this mean world syndrome. It's defined as a cognitive bias wherein people may perceive the world to be more dangerous than it actually is, due to long-term moderate to heavy exposure to violence-related content on mass media. Unlike my generation, young people today were raised in authoritarian conditions and flooded with 24-hour news channels and movies designed to keep them terrified. This has had its effects, one of which is the notion that the government is all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing. As a result, a lot of young people live in a constant state of stress, jumping at shadows. The reality is, outside of a small number of CEOs and political leaders, the state doesn't have the manpower to care about us. They really don't. Only your fear grants them authority over you, like a medieval peasant who thinks that God can read his thoughts, so he polices himself not because he wants to be good, but because he has this notion of a celestial beat cop looking over his shoulder. Harking back to what was said about the sheriff, 9/10 of government power is perception. Like a farmer who puts a scarecrow up in a field because he can't be everywhere. The scarecrow poses the birds no threat, but they avoid the area assuming that it's a human. The algorithms on the internet are their scarecrow. I just want us to remember not to give them too much power, not to allow them to fundamentally alter how we interact. If they get inside our heads, they win. It's just that simple. If your baseline assumption is that it's sophisticated to live in fear all the time, you're making a grave mistake. This is what they want. Fear literally makes you dumber. It releases hormones that create a fight or flight response and channels energy away from the brain. But more than just granting the oligarchs a boon by creating a dumbed-down populace, you're doing something else. You're fragmenting social norms. In the past, it was normal and natural for people to ask about each other in the course of conversations. That's how rapport is built. If we start thinking that asking natural questions is an invitation for a Fed to push a button whereupon ninjas jump out of bushes to get you, then we will be in a tremendous disadvantage as the powers that be essentially succeeded at dividing and conquering us. Aristotle makes this point in Politics in his chapter on how tyrannies are maintained, that the tyrant has to break up social structures so that the people can effectively organize. What has already been mentioned is as conducive as anything can be to preserve a tyranny, namely, to keep down those who are of an aspiring disposition, to take off those who will not submit, to allow no public meals, no clubs, no education, nothing at all, but to guard against everything that gives rise to high spirits or mutual confidence, nor to suffer the learned meetings of those who are at leisure to hold conversation with each other, and to endeavor by every means possible to keep all the people strangers to each other, for knowledge increases mutual confidence. Aristotle even talks about how the tyrant will dispatch spies to make people terrified of talking to each other. These spies almost sound like modern-day internet trolls. The spy's job was to scare people into silence, and those that refused to be scared? The spy was there to cause people to quarrel among themselves so that they fought each other, and not the tyrant. We read, "The tyrant endeavors to know what everyone who is under their power does and says, and for this purpose to employ spies." Such were those women whom the Syracusans called the Potagogides. Hero also used to send out listeners wherever there was any meeting or conversation, for the people dare not speak with freedom for fear of such persons, and if anyone does, there is the less chance of its being concealed, and to endeavor that the whole community should mutually accuse and come to blows with each other, friend with friend, the commons with the nobles, and the rich with each other. The point is, if we're all scared of each other, the tyrant wins. If we all collaborate on our own division, we're granting vast new powers to the state that it doesn't on its own have. I would once again caution you to understand that governance is a confidence trick. The craft of politicians, always and in all times, was to convince you to participate in your own enslavement, and the only way you can do that is by granting the tyrant your power. Could reading the New American Magazine boost your heart health, support your immune system, and help you lose 20 pounds of unsightly fat? The answer is no. But you should read it anyway. It'll keep you informed and provide information that cuts through the noise of lesser news outlets. thenewamerican.com. And don't forget to subscribe to us on social media and hit that like button.